Thank you. I'd like to begin by expressing thanks to Professor Leahy, to Robin Williams, and the trustees and organizers of the SAT for the opportunity to speak to you today. Can you all see my PowerPoint?
Yes, it's perfect, Roger.
Great. So here's a contemporary photo of the grand estate at Audley End in Essex, where in 1578, Queen Elizabeth I was feted by some of her leading nobles and educators. The original house was demolished by Thomas Howard, the first Earl of Suffolk, and a much grander mansion was built primarily for entertaining James I. And it has for some centuries passed down through the line of the successive barons Braybrook. It contains a large library with some hidden gems of English literary history. Audley End, for example, holds a copy of the 1551 Paris edition of Appian's Ancient History and Exquisite Chronicle in the Greek original. The copy pictured here, the first English translation published by Ralph Newbery and Henry Bindman in London in 1578, is bound in an exquisite 19th century Morocco binding by the famous binder Robert Riviere. According to Professor Stuart Gillespie in his authoritative 2004 Shakespeare's books, Shakespeare used Appian in 2 of the Roman plays. As he says, he uses Appian principally for the portrayal of Antony and more specifically for Antony's funeral oration on Caesar, which has, quote, similarly theatrical, almost operatic qualities in both writers. The handwriting that you're seeing here is reproduced from Casson Rubinstein's book, and you can see that it refers to Mark Antony's speech as a logos epitaphios in Greek, and then notes that this is Mark Antony's speech in regards to Julius Caesar. Now, I would maintain that this is a powerful form of evidence, much more compelling than most early modern annotations on account of its ability to suggest a dynamic reading, reflecting, and writing sequence. The annotator has focused precisely on the concept of the speech as recorded in Appian as an example of the genre of the logos epitaphios or funeral speech. When we are told by Professor Gillespie that Shakespeare turned to Appian precisely for this point, among others, in crafting Julius Caesar, this is surely a surprising coincidence, at least. Now, Casson and Rubinstein reproduce 11 more similar annotations, 12 from Appian, I'm sorry, I guess it should be 13, 12 from Appian and 1 from Dionysius of Halicarnasus, Roman Antiquities, 1546, that all give every appearance of being by the same writer. In both books and possibly others, the style of annotation, which often consists, as you see here, of a complete sentence summarizing an action, and also the graphic expression in the visible forms of the handwriting, are internally consistent. This says Cleopatra, fearing lest she be led in triumph, takes her own life. The handwriting is that of an Elizabethan italic of a writer trained circa 1550 to 1565 by a member of the Cambridge Italic School, which I will say a little bit more about later. Here in the Audley End copy of Appian in the same fine italic is both the before and after narratives of the final scene of Antony and Cleopatra. Here, Cleopatra, concealing herself in her monument, pretends death, which being heard by Antony, he kills himself. As we know, Shakespeare is fascinated by this dynamic since he used it already in Romeo and Juliet. In both plays, Shakespeare is fascinated by the double suicide of the lovers motif that is the result of one thinking that the other has killed herself when she has not. We will draw our survey of these annotations to a close with these few examples. In Appian alone, there are several more, all with curious and sometimes, I would argue, profound connections to the two Roman plays. So this evidence suggests a grave challenge to the Oxfordians. If these annotations are in Neville's hand, then they supply a convincing and large element of evidence supporting his authorship, at least of Antony and Cleopatra and possibly Julius Caesar as well. But are they, in fact, in Sir Henry Neville's handwriting? To answer this question, we must take a brief digression into the contemporary practice and theory of forensic handwriting identification. This discipline has little or nothing to do with graphology, which is the belief that a person's temperament or personality can be reconstructed through handwriting analysis, nor is it paleography, which is defined by Merriam-Webster as the study of ancient or antiquated writings or inscriptions, or the deciphering and interpretation of historical writing systems and manuscripts. Instead, it is a specialized field of study that focuses on such empirical questions as establishing the writership of question documents, or QDs. And it often does this in a legal context where the standards of evidence and argument are quite high. The idea of the QD, or the question document, is central to the forensic analyst. Until a document has been provably assigned to a known writer, it remains a question document. And provably assigned means that the investigator has conducted a thorough and a systematic study. That means she has considered all the elements of the problem and attempted to argue against her own bias. She can bring visible evidence, evidence that uses multiple high-resolution examples. We will call them, as I proceed, exemplars of individual letters to reveal the range of variation in both samples, and therefore to rule out the factors of chance and shared convention as explanatory variables. Then and only then, we are allowed to say with Sherlock Holmes that when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. So this classic work by Huber and Hedrick, Handwriting Identification, Facts and Fundamentals, identifies 21 elements that an analyst can use to compare any two samples of handwriting. For the sake of brevity, I will not try to list or explain them all here. In their studies of the Audley End annotations, neither Casson and Rubinstein, in their Sir Henry Neville as Shakespeare, or Ken Feinstein in his blog, mentions any of these standards or shows any awareness of such elementary concepts as exemplar or question document. Instead, Casson and Rubinstein claim that their study establishes Neville's writership of the question documents with 12 of their own unique features, like he used Roman numerals, or he used AU instead of A, as in France, and he drew little hands pointing to the text. They ask us to accept on faith, without any evidence or argument, that such features are sufficiently rare to provide a diagnostic identification. Rather than contriving such ad hoc methods, we shall here try to follow the practice of the professionals and proceed in a systematic fashion to compare the samples. So you have a right to ask who is the presenter. So let me give you a brief account of my own experience in this field. I have dedicated more than 600 hours of research and writing to original materials on forensic evaluations. I have written several research reports on different handwriting problems, including more than 4 attempts to match or disqualify anonymous documents as being in the handwriting of the 17th Earl of Oxford. These include the De Vere Geneva Bible, a 1580 diplomatic document in French, annotations in Sir Thomas Smith's books, and also annotations of an unidentified annotator of Seneca's collected works. And as Bill has already mentioned, I did publish an article in the Journal of Forensic Document Examination in 2017 that was about this document that you here see a piece of, which is a 19th century document, which I argued was in the handwriting of Herman Melville. So let me give you just a few key terms that I'm going to be using. Several of these I've already mentioned. An exemplar is an instance of a letter, a bigram, which is two letters next to one another, or a word used for comparison. We have question documents and we have known documents. We have two types of variation. There is variation that exists within the population of the handwriting of a given writer. There is also systematic variation, which is what distinguishes a sample of one writer from the sample of another writer. And holograph refers to a body of writing with a writer's signature on it. And that is, by the way, a legal term. As you might understand, if you're dealing with a legal question, you want to be sure that your known document is really known. So here is a inscription on the title page of the copy of Roman Antiquities, which is at Audley End. I'm not even sure exactly what this says, but I believe this may be, this part may be a signature. And so the question is, first of all, let's make the observation that we can see that this is clearly a different writing from that we were just looking at. The lettering is much more compressed. I would suspect this is probably somewhat earlier than what we were looking at in chronologically. And it's connected and it has greater calligraphic spontaneity, and it's more upright as well. The book appears to be unbound, and I wonder why that is. Well, it is normal for books of this age to have been repaired, often more than once, to keep their original bindings intact. Any book collector knows that preserving the original packaging makes a book, all other things being equal, more valuable. So here is that same inscription juxtaposed to a holograph of Sir Henry Neville in another book that is in the Merton College. And I don't know more about what this book is, but you can see here it says, from a gift, Henry Neville's Knight of Billingbear, which is Neville's estate. Are these two samples by the same writer? It's unlikely, but without closer study, it would be hazardous to make a definite determination. So here's the comparison that matters most. On the left, evidently in the same hand as those from the Appian that we were just looking at, but this time in the Roman Antiquities book, is the question document. And on the other side is Sir Henry Neville in a dedication of something to William Cecil. The first two lines of the question document are reproduced in Casson and Rubinstein, and the entire text by Ken Feinstein in a higher resolution form on his blog. Already, I would suggest to you that there are some significant differences here. The forms in the question document are considerably more angular. There's greater variation in the thickness of the lines. And the Sir Henry Neville document is a lot more fluid. Now, this could be the result, at least in part, of different writing implements. So let's learn a little more. A better answer requires a larger sample size. We need to assess the range of natural variation in Neville's hand. And here we can see that our first impression of his handwriting was skewed by the formal circumstance of the first inscription. Under more normal circumstances, such as these writings from Neville's notebooks, his hand is quite a bit freer and less controlled. So this is a lineup produced, and I have to thank Ken Feinstein, although I disagree with his conclusions. This was a very smart example that he arranged. An exemplar, we know, is a letter, a sequence of letters, or when the evidence permits, of entire words. And entire words is the gold standard because it allows you to see not only individual letters, but see them in identical contexts. So the forensic analyst makes use of exemplars to establish patterns that help to define the scope of variation. Casson and Rubinstein insist that these two sets are by the same person, but I disagree. And to understand why I disagree, let's increase the magnification a little bit and look at the letter S. We can confirm a clear difference here by noting that in the question document, the letter S is always formed on the same long S pattern with a little hook at the end of it in each case. Whereas in the Neville sample, we have a long S here, but it doesn't terminate in a hook. It ends in a club foot sticking out. There's a lot of variation in the way Neville makes the medial letter S's in the middle of words. He also uses this small s, and most characteristically of all, he uses this highly cursive form of a long S. These patterns look quite different already, even just looking at this one letter. Now, in their italic hand in Tudor Cambridge, Fairbanks and Dickens point out that a double S is a very useful letter to look at because there is a large range of variation in the types of the ways that writers, early modern writers, form this bigram. So in this case, 3 of these examples are from Fairbanks and Dickens, and I've added 2 more from contemporary copybooks that would have been used to train writers. In early modern handwriting, the second S of this pair is usually short, like a modern lowercase s, and the first S of the pair is usually long, although a few writers use 2 shorts. When we add the possibility of a ligature, which is this, or this, a connection between these 2 types of letters, we can see that this bigram allows for a typology that easily allows us to sort the hands into different bins. The key variations include a letter that is either long or short, depending on context, and either long, 2 through 4, or possibly looped, as in 5. Critically, the types 2 through 4 involve a similar hand motion. The pen leaves the page at least once in constructing the bigram, whereas type 5 anticipates a modern cursive in being one continuous sequence. These letters are not formed in the same way. So let's look at this bigram in our 2 samples here. We can see that the question document either uses type 4, the long S with the ligature attached to the short S, or sometimes just a long and a short. Neville, by contrast, consistently, regularly uses the italic S in this one continuous loop and ends it in a short S. So capital letters are larger and involve more complex shapes. And I'm almost done here. Thank you for your attention. And like bigrams, they are highly useful for the forensic analyst. Again, we can see here that the J of the question documents is more angular and also quite differently shaped than the J of the Neville document. The shapes are quite distinct here. One of them goes like this, and the other one starts way down here and goes up before coming back down. Despite a preference for capital letters, the analyst should not ignore information available from comparison of small letters. For even where the differences are subtle, a lineup of multiple exemplars can be quite revealing. We began by observing that the forms of the question document annotator are more angular as opposed to the more rounded or cursive forms of Neville's hand. And we can see that difference visibly even in these small letter M and N exemplars. Neville's hand, that of a man born in 1562, looks pretty au courant for the late Elizabethan or early Jacobean age. The angularity and the more conservative forms of connection of the annotator's hand suggests a stylization that could easily have looked old-fashioned by 1600. Sample size matters and provides proof. Wherever possible, the analyst should select at least 3 examples of any element used for comparison. Here we see in the first two sets here. Oops. I think I've lost my label there. The line forming the second hump in the Sir Henry Neville sample here, you could see it forms a definite loop at the top here. This feature is not visible here. And if we add a few more exemplars, we can see again the loop here, or the variant in Neville where we get this very sort of rounded jutting out like this. So we have a type 1 and a type 2 in Neville, whereas we have consistently neither of those two types in the question document. So I can draw a few conclusions here. The examples cited by Casson and Rubinstein and reproduced by Feinstein show intriguing possible connections to some of the ideas that Shakespeare used in shaping Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. And they are written in the margins of known Shakespeare sources. 2, the annotations in question are not in Sir Henry Neville's hand, in my opinion. And therefore, I will conclude that the Audley End volumes deserve closer study by qualified researchers to determine if these annotations match those of some other Elizabethan writer contemporaneous with Sir Henry Neville.